The night was darker than Clara had ever known. She had been walking for hours along the winding road that cut through the woods, guided only by the dim glow of her lantern, when she finally stumbled upon the village. Its streets were narrow and crooked, the houses leaning inward as though whispering secrets to each other. She expected to find the warmth of hearths and laughter spilling from the windows, but instead the silence pressed down upon her like a weight. Only one thing glowed faintly through the gloom, a candle flickering in every single window. The flames burned steady and tall, defying the restless wind that prowled between the homes. An old man appeared suddenly in the road, as though conjured by the shadows themselves. His eyes were clouded with age, but his hand was steady as he carried his own candle, the flame protected by a glass holder. "You are late," he rasped, his voice the sound of paper tearing. Clara stammered, unsure how to answer, but he shook his head and pressed a candle into her hand. Its wax was black, its flame unnaturally white. "Do not let it go out. Guard it as you would your own breath. When the last candle dies, so do you." Clara wanted to ask what he meant, but the man vanished between the houses before she could form the words. The flame flickered in her grasp, burning cold instead of warm, and instinct told her to obey. She walked through the village, her boots echoing too loudly on the cobblestones. Behind every window she passed, pale faces watched her, their eyes reflecting the candlelight. They did not smile, did not greet her, only stared as though measuring the length of her flame. A chill ran down her spine, and she hurried to the inn that stood at the center of the square. Inside the inn it was warmer, though every table held a candle identical to hers. The innkeeper, a gaunt woman with sharp cheekbones, greeted her with little more than a nod and ushered her upstairs to a small room. Clara set the candle on the bedside table, its glow filling the space with a steady, unnatural light. She had never been so tired, yet when she lay down she found herself unable to close her eyes. The candle seemed to demand her attention, whispering in the back of her mind that it must be watched. Each time her eyelids drooped, the flame sputtered, and she jerked awake, heart pounding. Hours passed like this until the air grew colder. A low sound rose from outside like the moaning of wind through hollow bones. Clara peered through the window and saw that the street below was empty, yet shadows moved across the stones, shapes too tall and too thin to belong to any human. They prowled from house to house, bending low toward each candle-lit window only to recoil when the flame resisted. Her own candle flared brighter as one of the shapes drew near, and the thing turned its faceless head toward her. For an endless moment it lingered, tasting the air, and Clara could not breathe. Then it melted back into the darkness, leaving her trembling. When dawn finally came, the village stirred back to life, though no one seemed surprised by the shadows of the night. Clara descended to the common room, where villagers sat silently at their tables, their candles burning before them. She tried to speak to one of them, a young woman with hollow cheeks, but the woman only raised her eyes to Clara's candle and said softly, "It still burns. That is good." Clara pressed her for answers, asking what would happen if the flame died, but the woman only shuddered and whispered, "Do not ask. Do not test it. Light is life, and life is light." The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though Clara could not rid herself of the feeling that she was being watched. The villagers avoided her questions, their eyes darting always toward her candle, as though it were the only part of her that mattered. By evening, she was told she must remain inside once night fell, for the dark would be waiting. She obeyed, though her curiosity gnawed at her. As the last sliver of sun disappeared, the shadows returned, slithering through the streets like ink spilled across stone. She stayed close to her candle, heart hammering as she listened to the scraping sound outside her door, the faint whispering that seemed to call her name. When the flame dipped suddenly, as though pinched by unseen fingers, Clara panicked. She shielded it with her hands, whispering desperately for it to hold on. For a moment it nearly vanished, and the whispering outside swelled into a hungry chorus. Then the flame steadied, burning taller than before, and the voices retreated. Clara sank to the floor, clutching the table with trembling hands, and realized the old man's words had not been a warning but a law. She had survived this night only because the candle had lived, but in the faint hiss of the flame she thought she heard laughter, soft, distant, and cruel. The following morning Clara ventured out again, her candle carefully carried in its holder. The streets were oddly quiet, as though the villagers avoided looking at the sky. She noticed their faces were pale, their lips cracked as though parched, and yet none of them drank from the well in the square. The well itself was covered with a heavy wooden lid, nailed shut with rusted iron. Clara asked one man why they did not use it, but he only glanced nervously at her candle and muttered, "The water remembers." He hurried away before she could question him further. The unease grew heavier with each passing hour. Children played silently with wooden dolls, their eyes darting to their candles as though expecting them to gutter at any moment. An old woman sweeping her steps froze when Clara's flame flickered in the breeze, her broom clattering to the ground as she hissed, "Shield it! Shield it!" Clara obeyed quickly, holding her hand around the flame until it steadied. The old woman's face was gray with fear, and without another word she shut her door and bolted it from within. That evening the innkeeper placed a small plate of food in front of Clara, though she herself did not eat. Clara pushed the dish aside, demanding answers. "What happens if the candle dies?" she asked. The innkeeper's eyes, black as coal, stared at her for a long time before she finally spoke. "When the flame dies, they come in. And when they come in, there is no morning." Her voice trembled, though her face remained hard. Clara shuddered, realizing the shadows she had seen were not merely tricks of the night, but predators, waiting for weakness. Sleep became impossible. Each night was worse than the last. The scratching outside her room grew louder, more insistent. She could see the door shudder as though something pressed against it, trying to force its way inside. Once she heard breathing, long, wet inhalations that made her stomach twist. And through it all, the candle sputtered, its flame defiant but fragile. She wondered how long it could truly last. On the fourth night, she made the mistake of blinking too long. Her head dropped forward and she drifted for only a heartbeat. But when her eyes snapped open, the candle was nearly extinguished. The flame was nothing more than a red ember, and the darkness surged forward with a cry like the wailing of 1,000 voices. Clara screamed, snatching the candle in her hands, shaking it desperately as though life itself depended on it. Just as the last thread of fire seemed ready to vanish, it caught again, bursting into a tall, unnatural flame. The darkness reeled back, but Clara was not relieved. She had seen it, something standing at the foot of her bed, its body made of smoke and bone. Its fingers reaching, her scream had carried through the inn. And by morning, the villagers gathered in silence outside her door. They looked at her with pity, some shaking their heads, others clutching their own candles tighter. The old man from her first night reappeared among them, leaning on a cane, his cloudy eyes fixed on her with grim certainty. "The flame is tied to you now," he rasped. "It feeds as you feed, breathes as you breathe, but it weakens each time you falter. And when it fails, so will you." Clara demanded to know why she had been given the candle at all, why the villagers lived under such torment. The old man did not answer directly. He only raised a finger toward the well in the square. "The answer lies below. But beware, child. The well remembers what we tried to forget." His words chilled her more than the night itself, for she felt a pull toward that sealed place, as though something beneath the earth was calling her name. That night, when the shadows gathered again, Clara pressed her forehead to the glass of the window and looked down at the square. The lid of the well gleamed in the moonlight, and though no hand touched it, she saw it tremble. The nails groaned, the wood shifted, and she heard a faint whisper rise from its depths. Her name? Clara clutched her candle, her knuckles white around its holder. She understood now that the flame was more than protection. It was a tether, binding her to this place, to the terror that stalked the night. She knew she could not leave. The village would not let her. The shadows would not let her. And the well, deep in waiting, would never let her forget that it was watching. The next day, Clara felt the weight of exhaustion crushing her body. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep. Her hands trembled whenever she tried to hold the candle steady, and her mind wandered to half-formed dreams even while awake. The villagers watched her with a mixture of fear and pity, though none dared approach her for long. Every glance was fixed on the flame she carried, as though it were the true master of her soul now, not Clara herself. She could no longer shake the feeling that she was less a traveler and more a sacrifice chosen for something she could not yet name. Her curiosity about the well grew stronger, despite the warnings. By midday, she found herself standing in the square, staring at the heavy wooden lid nailed tight across the opening. The nails were old, blackened with rust, but still firm. When she touched the wood, she felt it pulse faintly, like a heartbeat buried beneath the earth. She pulled her hand back at once, gooseflesh rising along her arms. Yet even in her fear, the whisper she had heard the night before returned, slithering through her thoughts, urging her to listen. That night the wind howled around the inn with unusual force. The candle flickered constantly, and Clara shielded it with her body, her eyes darting to the corners of the room where shadows swelled like living things. She pressed her back to the wall and whispered to herself, a desperate mantra of survival. But then, through the shriek of the wind, she heard something else. A voice. It was not outside, but within the walls themselves. Faint, muffled, like someone calling through stone. The voice repeated one word over and over, soft yet insistent. Light. 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 Clara nearly dropped the candle when she realized the sound came from beneath the floorboards. Heart pounding, she crouched low and pressed her ear to the boards. The voice grew louder, and she recognized it. Her own. It was her voice crying from below, begging for light. She staggered back, trembling, staring at the boards as though they might split open and reveal her reflection crawling up from the depths. Unable to endure the suffocating fear any longer, she stumbled out of her room and down the stairs, clutching her candle as if it were the last anchor to sanity. The innkeeper stood in the hallway, blocking her path. Her face was pale, eyes wide, hands trembling. "Don't go near the well," she whispered. "It's waiting for you. It's always waiting." Clara tried to push past her, but the woman clutched her arm with surprising strength. "You don't understand. Once it calls your name, you belong to it. That's why we gave you the candle, to delay the taking. But nothing delays forever." The woman's grip loosened suddenly, as though an unseen hand pulled her away. She gasped, her face contorted in silent terror, and then retreated into the shadows, vanishing as if she had never stood there at all. Clara was left alone, the candlelight quivering across the walls. Her steps carried her outside, though she could not remember deciding to move. The square lay empty beneath the cold stare of the moon, the nailed lid of the well casting long shadows like clawed fingers. The whisper rose again, louder now, calling her name with desperate hunger. Clara felt her legs weaken, her chest tighten as though invisible hands were pressing her forward. She shook her head violently, clutching the candle to her chest, but the pull was stronger than her will. At the edge of the well, she fell to her knees, her breath ragged, sweat chilling her skin. The wood beneath her palms was warm, almost fevered, and she heard voices layered upon one another, countless voices rising in a chorus of despair. Some begged for release, others cursed her name, and still others simply laughed, a hollow, endless laughter that made her ears bleed. She pressed the candle closer, and the flame flared unnaturally bright, forcing the whispers to recede for a moment. In that brightness she saw them, faces pressed against the inside of the wood, their eyes hollow sockets, their mouths stretched wide in eternal cries. Souls trapped beneath, waiting for the flame to fail. She staggered back, nearly dropping the candle, her mind spinning with horror. The well did not merely remember, it devoured. And the villagers had built their lives around feeding it, passing its curse from stranger to stranger, binding innocence with the light of a candle that was never meant to burn forever. Clara realized with crushing clarity that she had not been given protection but a prison. The flame was her shackle, tying her to the hunger below. When dawn came, the villagers gathered in silence once more. This time their faces bore no pity, only resignation. The old man leaned on his cane, his cloudy eyes fixed upon her. "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked softly. "It knows you now. There is no turning back." Clara wanted to scream at him, to demand why they condemned her to such a fate. But her throat was dry, her voice lost to terror. The old man turned away before she could speak, muttering, "When the last candle dies, so does the world above." That night, Clara locked herself in her room, dragging a chair against the door, though she knew wood and iron would never keep out what lurked in the dark. The candle burned steadily at her side, its flame throwing twisted shadows across the walls, and she found herself staring at it with growing dread. The light that once gave her comfort now felt like a chain, binding her to the thing in the well, forcing her to feed it with her fear and exhaustion. Her eyelids drooped, her body screamed for sleep, but every time her head sank forward she jerked upright, terrified that the flame would die if she dared surrender. The hours dragged, and in that endless dark her thoughts began to unravel. She imagined the wax dripping down was not wax at all, but her own lifeblood, spilling slowly into the night. Each hiss and pop of the wick sounded like a whisper, words just out of reach, secrets murmured too softly to hear. She pressed her hands to her ears, but still the sound burrowed into her skull, growing louder until she swore the candle itself was speaking. Her name again and again, drawn out into a mocking chant. Clara, Clara, Clara. Desperation clawed at her mind. She stumbled to the window, clutching the candle, and looked down at the square. The lid of the well gleamed wetly in the moonlight, though she knew no rain had fallen. It glistened as though covered in sweat or tears, and the nails that bound it seemed to pulse like veins beneath skin. Her stomach twisted violently, bile rising in her throat. She staggered back from the window, but in that moment she swore she saw movement, something vast shifting beneath the lid, straining against the weight of wood and rusted iron. The scratching at her door returned, but now it was different. Not claws, not desperate scraping, but slow, deliberate knocks, 3 times, steady and patient. Clara froze, her breath trapped in her chest. Another 3 knocks followed, louder, more demanding. She clutched the candle so tightly her knuckles whitened. Then, to her horror, a voice whispered from the other side of the door. It was her own voice again. "Open, Clara, let me in. You can't hold the light forever." Her body shook with terror, but she forced herself not to move, not to answer. The candle flame bent low, nearly extinguished, and the whisper turned to laughter. Low, guttural laughter that filled the room until it felt like the walls themselves were caving in. She screamed, pressing her back against the farthest corner, shielding the flame with her body. At last the knocking stopped, the laughter faded, and silence returned, heavy and suffocating. When morning came, Clara's face was ashen, her eyes bloodshot and sunken. She left the inn with the candle still burning, ignoring the villagers who parted silently before her. She could no longer bear their stares, their silence, their complicity. She marched to the square, her heart hammering, and stood before the well once more. Her hands trembled violently, but she forced herself to press her ear against the lid. The voices surged into her like a flood, hundreds of them screaming, begging, cursing. And beneath them all, deeper and more powerful, another voice, ancient, cold, and vast. Not calling her name, but commanding her. "Bring it down." She staggered back, clutching her head, the candle nearly toppling from her grasp. She realized then that the villagers were not protecting themselves with their candles. They were feeding this thing, keeping it alive, tethered, waiting. The light was not salvation, but sustenance, a ritual to ensure the hunger below never starved. And she was the latest victim forced into the cycle, bound by flame and fear. That evening, as dusk bled into night, Clara made a decision. She would not be its prisoner any longer. She would go to the well and face what lay within, even if it meant her death. She carried the candle to the square as the last rays of sun vanished. The villagers watching from behind shuttered windows, their faces pale and hollow. At the edge of the well, she placed the candle on the lid, its flame burning high and strong, and pressed both hands against the wood. The voices shrieked in triumph, sensing her surrender, and the ground shuddered beneath her knees. With a cry of rage and terror, she tore at the nails, her fingers bleeding as she wrenched them free one by one. The wood splintered, the lid cracked, and from below surged a blast of air so foul it nearly suffocated her. The candle flame shot upward, unnaturally tall, casting monstrous shadows across the square. The voices rose in a deafening chorus, a tide of madness threatening to crush her mind. Still she clawed at the lid, desperate to uncover the truth, to end the torment once and for all. At last, the final nail came loose, and the lid split apart, falling into the darkness below. The well yawned open before her, a pit of endless black. The candle flickered violently, nearly going out, and from the depths she saw them, faces upon faces, twisted and screaming, their eyes glowing like embers. They surged upward, a mass of writhing souls bound together, reaching with skeletal hands. Clara screamed, stumbling back, but the candle flared bright once more, and in that blinding light she saw the thing behind them. Something vast and formless, its eyes like suns swallowed in shadow, its mouth a cavern that stretched across eternity. The well was not merely a prison. It was a door, and she had opened it. The ground shook beneath Clara's feet as the well's contents erupted upward, a storm of shadows and voices pouring into the night. The square was filled with a cacophony of screams, not only from the trapped souls that surged forth, but from the villagers who had dared to peek from behind their shutters. The moment the lid split open, their candles guttered in unison, flames shrinking low as though bowing to the force that had been unleashed. Clara stumbled backward, clutching her own candle, which blazed brighter than ever before, the flame rising as tall as her face, illuminating her in a sickly golden glow. The tide of souls rose higher, clawing and writhing, but none dared cross the threshold of her light. They circled her instead, screaming, stretching their hands toward her flame as though starving for it. The massive faces twisted in agony, their mouths gaping wider, their hollow eyes blazing with a desperate hunger that made Clara's stomach wrench. She could feel the pull of the well behind them, something colossal shifting within the abyss, the force that bound them, the master of this ritual. Its voice was no longer a whisper but a roar, echoing in her skull, filling her bones with dread. Burn! Burn for me! Her knees buckled, her arms trembling violently. She wanted to throw the candle into the pit, to give it what it wanted, to end the torment. But a faint voice inside her screamed against it, the last shard of her own will. She held the flame tighter, lifting it above her head, the light spreading across the square. The souls shrieked and recoiled, their bodies dissolving into mist under its brilliance. The entity in the pit bellowed, the sound so deep it cracked the stones beneath her feet. The ground opened in jagged lines, swallowing chunks of the square as though the earth itself sought to drag her down. Clara staggered backward, narrowly avoiding a fissure that split where she had been standing. The villagers, once silent, now poured from their homes in chaos. Some fell to their knees, praying with trembling hands lifted to the sky. Others screamed and ran blindly into the night, their candles snuffed out in the rising wind. Clara watched in horror as the shadows devoured them, their bodies swallowed whole by darkness, leaving nothing but faint echoes of their cries. The ritual had broken, and now the hunger of the well could no longer be contained. She turned and fled, her candle still burning tall, racing through the twisting streets of the village. Behind her the ground cracked open, houses crumbled, and the air filled with the reek of sulfur and decay. The voices followed her, shrieking her name, demanding her surrender. Her breath came ragged, her lungs burning, but she pressed forward, guided only by the fragile glow of the candle in her hands. Every step felt heavier, as though unseen hands clawed at her ankles, dragging her toward the abyss. At the edge of the village, she collapsed against the rotted fence of the graveyard, gasping for breath. The candle flame wavered but did not die, though she could feel its heat burning her palms. It no longer felt like fire, but like a living heart, pulsing against her skin, feeding from her fear. She knew now why the villagers had kept the ritual alive. The flame was not merely a shackle, it was a bargain. As long as it burned, the entity below remained tethered, fed by the fear of its bearer. But if it died, then nothing would bind it, nothing would stop it from spilling into the world above. She pressed her forehead to the cold stone of a grave marker, tears streaking her dirt-stained cheeks. There was no escape. She was bound as surely as those souls had been, her life tied to the last candle. The realization broke something inside her, and for a moment she almost welcomed the thought of letting it go out, of surrendering to the dark. But then she remembered the faces she had seen in the massive shadows, souls screaming for release, trapped for eternity. If she gave up now, she would join them. She would never escape. The earth shuddered again, and from the direction of the square came a sound so horrifying it rooted her to the spot. A roar, not of one creature but of thousands, blended into a single voice of rage. She lifted her head in time to see the horizon glow red, the village consumed by fire and shadow. Above it, rising higher than the rooftops, a shape unfurled, a colossal figure of smoke and bone, its limbs stretching like roots across the sky, its head crowned with horns of ash. Its eyes glowed like dying stars, fixed directly upon her. The candle blazed in response, the flame nearly blinding, and she realized with a sick certainty that the entity was tethered to her now. It would not leave her until she surrendered the light, until she became one of the faces in its endless tide. Clara staggered to her feet, clutching the candle as though it were both her savior and her executioner. Her legs carried her forward without thought beyond the graveyard, into the forest that pressed against the village. The trees loomed black and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky, but she plunged into their depths, the candle guiding her path. The voices pursued her, echoing through the trees, whispering her name with every gust of wind. She stumbled over roots, her dress torn, her body bruised, yet she did not stop. The forest grew thicker, darker, the air heavy with the stench of rot, but the flame never faltered. It burned hotter, brighter, as though the deeper she fled, the more the entity's hunger grew. At last she fell to her knees in a clearing, her body too weak to continue, the candle burning so fiercely it scorched her skin. She stared at it in despair, her lips trembling. It dawned on her then, a truth so cruel it stole her breath. The last candle was never meant to be a light of salvation. It was bait, and she was the offering. Clara's breath rattled in her chest as she knelt in the clearing, the forest pressing in around her like a prison of black iron. The candle flame towered, its glow unnatural, casting shadows that twisted into shapes of bodies writhing and contorting, their faces stretched into grotesque parodies of grief. She could not tell whether the visions were tricks of her mind or true glimpses of the souls bound to the fire. Her hands trembled, blisters forming where the hot wax dripped, and still she held on, unable to let go. She whispered to herself, over and over, a broken chant, "I am still here, I am still here." But even her voice sounded like an echo borrowed from the well. The trees around her began to creak, their trunks bending unnaturally, leaning toward her as though drawn to the flame. The branches scraped the ground, clawing closer with every passing moment. The forest itself was shifting, alive, hungry for what she carried. The candle hissed violently, its light forcing the branches back, but with each pulse of illumination, Clara felt her strength draining. The flame was feeding, and it was feeding on her. Her mind drifted to the faces she had seen rising from the pit, countless souls clawing at one another, begging for light that would never be theirs. What if they too had carried candles once? What if they had been wanderers like her, lured into the village, bound to the ritual, until finally their flames had gone out and their bodies were swallowed into the endless dark? The thought nearly broke her. She saw herself among them, her own face pressed against the wood of the well lid, her mouth frozen in a scream, her eyes empty sockets burning with a pale glow. She shook her head violently, trying to banish the vision, but the more she denied it, the more real it became. A low rumble passed through the ground, and Clara turned her head toward the horizon. Through the twisted lattice of trees she glimpsed the village, or what remained of it. Smoke poured upward in thick columns, lit from beneath by an unnatural fire that burned without consuming, a fire that pulsed like a heartbeat. The colossal figure she had seen before rose fully from the ruins now, its limbs stretching impossibly far, its form flickering between substance and shadow. The horns of ash crowned its head, and its eyes blazed like dying embers. It moved without, moving, its vast form sliding through the night sky as though distance meant nothing, and its gaze was fixed on her. The voices grew louder in the clearing, circling her like vultures. She could not see them, but she felt them, souls pressing close, whispering temptations in her ears. "Rest, Clara. Let it go. You've carried it long enough. Blow it out and be free." The words were her own voice, distorted, fractured, echoing from every direction. She covered her ears, but it did not silence them. They spoke through her bones, her blood, her breath, and part of her wanted to obey. Part of her wanted the struggle to end. She forced herself to her feet, though her legs wavered beneath her. Her body screamed in pain, every muscle trembling, but she pressed forward deeper into the forest, guided by the flame. The trees thickened. The air grew heavy, until she stumbled into another clearing, unlike the first. At its center stood a stone altar, ancient and crumbling, covered in moss and carved with symbols she did not recognize. Around it lay the remnants of dozens of candles, melted stubs long extinguished, their wax hardened into grotesque shapes. Clara's heart lurched. This was where it had all begun. The altar radiated a cold so intense, her breath fogged the air. As she stepped closer, the candle in her hand sputtered, shrinking for the first time since she had fled the village. The shadows crept in eagerly, pressing closer, their voices shrieking in triumph. Clara felt herself falter, her knees striking the earth. The flame wavered violently, and for a moment she thought it would vanish. But then the altar pulsed, a faint glow spreading from its carvings, and the candle roared back to life, nearly burning her face. It was then she understood. The altar was not a place of protection, but of renewal. Each victim had been brought here, their candle consumed, their soul devoured, and the cycle continued. She was standing on the heart of the ritual, the place where the last candle always burned down to nothing. She stared at the melted stubs scattered around her feet, each one a life, each one a final breath snuffed out by the endless hunger of the well. And she knew with a sinking certainty that her candle would join them soon. The colossal figure moved, closer, blotting out the stars, its shape twisting above the treetops. The ground quaked, splitting the altar stones, and a voice boomed across the forest. "Give it to me." Clara clutched the candle tighter, tears streaming down her face. She was shaking so violently she feared she would drop it, and still the flame did not falter. It wanted to burn. It wanted to consume her. She staggered forward and pressed the candle onto the altar. The wax hissed as it touched the stone, the flame blazing higher than ever before. The voices screamed in a frenzy, the shadows swirling violently around her, and from the trees poured figures, villagers twisted and hollow, their eyes black, their mouths filled with ash. They surrounded the clearing, their hands reaching out, their whispers blending into a single demand. "Blow it out." Clara shook her head, sobbing, clutching her ears as the pressure mounted. Her mind felt as though it would split apart, her skull cracking beneath the weight of countless voices. The flame screamed too, a high-pitched whine that pierced her bones. She fell to her knees before the altar, staring into the heart of the fire, seeing faces flicker in its glow. Souls trapped, begging, cursing, crying. And within the fire, she saw her own reflection, smiling with hollow eyes. She realized then that there was no salvation, no escape. The last candle was not a shield, not a prison, but a chain between worlds, and she was its link. The wind outside the cottage grew violent, clawing at the wooden shutters until they rattled like bones in a coffin. Clara clutched the nearly spent candle, its flame barely surviving against the gusts that seemed to seep through the very walls. Each flicker of light cast monstrous shapes across the room, shadows that did not match the furniture, shadows that seemed to lean closer every time the flame weakened. She pressed her hand against the trembling table to steady herself, feeling the grain of the old wood beneath her fingertips, grounding herself in the small sliver of reality the candle still afforded. Evelyn stirred weakly in the chair beside her, her eyes glassy and distant, her skin drained of color as though something had been leeching the life from her with every passing hour. Clara whispered her friend's name, but Evelyn's lips only moved soundlessly, a prayer or a plea trapped in her throat. The shadows recoiled suddenly as though offended by Clara's voice, then surged forward again the moment silence returned, pressing against the faint circle of protection cast by the flame. Clara's chest tightened as she realized that the candle had burned lower than she had dared to notice. The wax puddled into a thin pool, its heat dangerously close to extinguishing the wick. She thought of the villagers' warnings, how one must never let the light die completely, and for the first time she believed every trembling word they had spoken. She could almost hear their voices now, echoing in her head. The dark is not empty. It waits, it remembers. Her eyes darted to the wooden chest in the corner, the one she had avoided opening when she first entered the cottage. Something within it scratched faintly, a sound so small she might have mistaken it for wood settling if not for the rhythm, as though long nails tapped patiently from the inside. She told herself it was only her imagination, but the scratching grew louder with each dying beat of the flame. Her heart pounded as she stumbled to her feet, the candle clutched tightly in one hand. The shadows slithered across the floor like spilled ink, forming long, twisted fingers that reached toward her ankles. She stepped back sharply, nearly tripping over Evelyn's chair, and realized there was no safe place left in the room except within the candle's glow. The air smelled of sulfur now, thick and choking, making her eyes sting. She coughed and nearly lost her grip on the candle, and in that split second the flame bent dangerously low, almost smothered by her breath. A low moan filled the cottage, vibrating through the walls, a sound that was neither entirely human nor entirely beast. It was the darkness itself, hungry and aware of how close it was to winning. Clara's gaze snapped to the fireplace, cold and filled with ashes. If she could find kindling, perhaps she could transfer the flame, create a larger fire to push the shadows back. But as she stepped toward it, she felt the boards beneath her feet sag unnaturally, as though something beneath the floor was shifting, crawling, waiting for her to make a mistake. She froze, her lungs refusing to draw another breath until the sound stopped. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the house fell into silence again, leaving only the faint hiss of the dwindling flame. Evelyn gasped weakly then, her head jerking upward as though something had seized her from the inside. Her eyes rolled back, revealing nothing but the whites, and her lips parted in a guttural whisper, "Don't." "Let it out!" The words chilled Clara to her core. She spun toward the chest again, realizing Evelyn's warning had not been about the shadows, but about whatever scratched and clawed inside that sealed box. The curse was not only in the dark, but in the objects left behind, traps for the curious, prisons for the damned. Clara stumbled back toward her friend, shaking her shoulders, desperate to pull her from whatever grip the darkness had on her. But Evelyn's body jerked violently, her hands shooting out to grab Clara's wrist with impossible strength. The candle tilted, hot wax spilling onto Clara's skin, searing her flesh. She cried out, but Evelyn's grip tightened, forcing her to hold the candle steady even as the flame nearly touched the edge of her hair. Clara's heart pounded as she realized the thing inside her friend was trying to extinguish the light, trying to end the last fragile barrier between them and the void pressing in from every corner.